You can feel it, can't you? Something in you has already shifted. Your thoughts are no longer moving in the same circles. Your reactions are not as automatic. You have been learning how to choose a different inner state. You have been speaking to yourself in a new language. You have been reaching for a new frequency, a new identity, a new way of standing inside reality. And yet the outer world still looks stubborn, still quiet, still unchanged in all the places where you expected movement. That is the moment when frustration starts to whisper. It does not arrive as a scream. It arrives as a question. What am I missing? Why is nothing opening? Why does it feel like I am doing the inner work and getting no reflection back? You meditate, you visualize, you redirect your attention. You try to become the conscious observer instead of the old reactive self. You tell yourself the shift is happening, but then another day passes and the evidence you were hoping for still does not show up. So the mind begins hunting for a flaw. Maybe the method is wrong. Maybe the timing is wrong. Maybe you are not aligned enough. Maybe there is some hidden rule nobody told you about. But what if the issue is not your effort at all? What if the real interference lives below the surface, in the part of you that is still broadcasting a completely different message? This is where most people miss the turning point. They think manifestation is controlled by the words they repeat or the images they hold for a few focused moments. But the field responds to more than isolated intention. It responds to the pattern that becomes your atmosphere. It responds to the signal you live inside, not just the signal you visit for a few minutes and then abandon. This is why a person can say, "I am ready," while their body is braced for disappointment. They can say, "It is already mine," while their nervous system is still waiting to be convinced. They can declare abundance, love, freedom, healing, expansion, and still carry an invisible expectation of delay. And that contradiction matters deeply, because the moment thought, emotion, and expectation begin pointing in different directions, your system loses coherence. It hesitates. It slows. It stabilizes around what feels most familiar, not around what sounds most inspiring. Think about that for a second. The conscious mind may be speaking the language of possibility, but the body may still be fluent in survival. The heart may be trying to open, but the deeper pattern may still be scanning for what is missing. The voice may say, "I trust," while the inner state quietly asks, "But where is the proof?" That split is subtle, which is exactly why it is so powerful. It does not feel dramatic. It does not always feel like fear. Sometimes it feels responsible. Sometimes it feels logical. Sometimes it even feels spiritual. But beneath the surface, it is still sending a message of not yet. And the quantum field cannot fully organize around a signal that keeps dividing itself. The field is not confused by your words. It is reading your resonance. It is reading the emotional undertone. It is reading the expectation hidden under your rituals. Are you standing in the energy of arrival, or are you secretly leaning toward confirmation? Are you living as the version of you who already belongs to this reality, or are you still watching the door, waiting for reality to prove that you are allowed to enter? That waiting changes everything. It seems small. It seems harmless. Yet it creates an entire reality. The moment your inner world says, "It is coming," your energy still places the desired experience somewhere ahead of you, somewhere outside of you, somewhere future-based. And whenever the mind places something in the future, it automatically confirms that it is absent now. Can you see the trap? You feel hopeful, but hope still contains distance. You feel anticipation, but anticipation still contains separation. You feel close, but close is not the same as here. This is why so many people stay locked in beautiful ideas without ever feeling the ground of embodiment. They are tuned into possibility, but not settled into identity. They are fascinated by the next version of themselves, but not rooted in being that version now. They speak to the future as if it is approaching them, while never realizing that the deepest shift happens only when the future stops being a destination and becomes an inner normal. Because what is natural does not beg for evidence. What is natural does not keep peeking around the corner. What is natural does not need constant reassurance. When something truly belongs to your identity, you do not perform it. You do not chase it. You do not keep checking whether it is still there. You move from it the way you breathe, quietly, automatically, without ceremony, without strain. So let me ask you something. Are you aligned, or are you rehearsing alignment? Are you resting in the state, or are you visiting it and then stepping back into the old self the moment nothing external moves? Are you being the conscious observer, or are you still measuring the gap between what you feel inside and what you see outside? The answer to that question reveals more than any technique ever could. The deepest block is rarely a visible block. It is usually a contradiction so refined that it masquerades as progress. You may be doing all the right things on the surface while still carrying an inner posture of waiting. You may be holding affirmations in the mind while holding absence in the body. You may be naming your new reality while emotionally referencing the old one. And if that is happening, nothing is wrong with you. It simply means the signal has not become unified yet. This is not failure. This is feedback. It is the moment where awareness becomes sacred. Not because you need to judge yourself, but because you finally get to see the hidden split. You get to see where the old identity still slips underneath the new words. You get to notice where desire is still mixed with doubt, where intention is still tangled with impatience, where faith is still leaning on proof. That noticing is powerful because once you see the contradiction clearly, you stop romanticizing it. You stop calling it alignment when it is actually waiting in disguise. And once that becomes clear, a new question rises. Not what else should I do, but what signal am I really living in? Not what method will fix this, but what expectation is quietly steering my system? Not how can I force reality to move faster, but where am I still announcing to the field that I do not fully believe this is mine now? That is where the shift begins to feel real. Not when you get louder, not when you push harder, not when you become obsessed with perfect thoughts. It begins when you stop feeding the split between desire and identity. It begins when the body is no longer preparing for the old story. It begins when expectation softens, when waiting dissolves, when your inner world stops stretching everything into later and starts settling into now. This is the doorway. This is where the conscious observer becomes more than an idea. This is where your frequency stops being a performance and starts becoming your home. This is where your vibration is no longer something you try to raise by force, but something that naturally changes because the contradiction is losing its grip. And once that happens, reality starts reading a cleaner signal, not a perfect signal, a clear one. And clarity in the field is everything. Maybe this is why the process has felt so exhausting. You believed you were trying to create movement, but in truth you were often trying to escape contradiction. You were trying to outthink an expectation your body had not released. You were trying to rise into a new state while still carrying a private relationship with delay. And every time you looked outward for confirmation, that private relationship grew stronger. Not because you were weak, but because the old pattern was still receiving your attention. So breathe into this. You do not need to become someone fake. You do not need to pretend the outer world does not exist. You do not need to deny what you see. What you do need is honesty. Clean, luminous honesty. Can you admit where you are still waiting? Can you admit where you still believe life must send a signal before you are allowed to settle? Can you admit where you still think alignment means preparing for the miracle instead of living from the reality that already exists in the invisible? The moment you answer those questions, something opens. The pressure starts to fall away because now you are no longer trapped in the illusion that more effort alone will solve it. Now you understand that the hidden tension is not about lack of desire. It is about mixed signals. Now the next layer reveals itself, and this is where the journey becomes even more deceptive. Once you begin to understand that waiting sends the wrong signal, the mind quickly makes another move. It turns the process into a project. It decides that if waiting is the problem, then constant discipline must be the answer. So you tighten your focus. You watch your thoughts more carefully. You try to sustain the right state every hour of the day. You become vigilant. You become serious. You start managing your inner world like it is a fragile machine that could collapse if you relax for even a moment. At first, this feels powerful. It feels committed. It feels like spiritual maturity. You tell yourself you are being intentional. You tell yourself you are protecting your frequency. You tell yourself you are staying in alignment. But look closer. Beneath that discipline, there is often pressure. Beneath that pressure, there is tension. And beneath that tension, there is a quiet fear that if you stop controlling the process, everything will fall apart. Can you feel how heavy that becomes? Every thought must be inspected. Every emotion must be corrected. Every reaction must be reviewed. You start living in a state of internal supervision. You are no longer simply aware. You are monitoring. You are no longer resting in identity. You are trying to maintain identity. And the difference between those two states is enormous. What is natural does not need to be constantly defended. What is integrated does not need continuous management. Think about anything in your life that already feels normal. You do not wake up and rehearse it. You do not perform rituals to convince yourself it belongs to you. You do not scan your mind every few minutes to make sure you still have permission to embody it. It is simply there. It moves through you without effort because your system has already accepted it as familiar. That is what true embodiment feels like. Not intensity, not obsession, familiarity. The state stops feeling like an elevated performance and begins to feel like home. But when you are still trying to hold the state with effort, that effort itself becomes evidence that the state is not yet natural. And the field reads that. Your nervous system reads that. Your subconscious reads that. They all hear the same hidden message. I am still trying to become this. I am still working to keep this alive. I am still not fully relaxed inside this identity. And the moment you start trying to become something, you create distance from it. You separate yourself from the version of you that already is it. You place the desired self on one side and the current self on the other, then spend all day building bridges between them. But bridges imply distance. Effort implies separation. Control implies instability. You cannot fully broadcast certainty while secretly acting like the state might disappear if you stop gripping it. This is why so many people feel exhausted by inner work. They are not exhausted by transformation itself. They are exhausted by self-surveillance. They are drained by the constant attempt to manage every signal, suppress every wobble, and force every thought into compliance. But consciousness does not deepen through strain. Alignment does not bloom through panic. The field does not open wider because you became harder on yourself. In fact, the more force you apply, the more fragile the state begins to feel. Why? Because force tells the system something important. It says this is not safe enough to trust. It says this is not embodied enough to relax into. It says this reality still depends on constant intervention, and once that message becomes active, you end up reinforcing the very instability you were trying to eliminate. So what happens? You enter the desired state, but only under supervision. You feel expanded, but only while watching yourself. You experience clarity, but only while mentally holding it in place. The moment your attention moves elsewhere, the state seems to weaken. Then you panic. You think you lost it. You think you failed. So you try harder. You tighten the grip. You become even more determined to think perfectly, feel perfectly, align perfectly. But the harder you grip, the more artificial the whole thing becomes. That is not embodiment. That is performance with spiritual language wrapped around it. And there is another layer even deeper than effort. It is checking, constant checking, quiet checking, sophisticated checking, the kind that disguises itself as awareness. You tell yourself you are being conscious, but what are you actually doing? You are testing the state, measuring the state, asking whether the state is still present, asking whether it is working, asking whether you still feel aligned, asking whether your vibration dropped, asking whether the universe has responded, asking whether the sign has arrived, asking whether the manifestation is close. Every one of those questions seems innocent, yet each one carries a pulse of doubt, not dramatic doubt, not loud fear, refined doubt, spiritualized doubt, the kind that says, I trust, but let me verify. I believe, but let me monitor. I know, but let me check one more time. Do you see the pattern? The conscious observer becomes the anxious manager. Awareness turns into control. Presence turns into self-interruption. You plant a new identity in the soil of your being, and then you keep digging it up to inspect the roots. Is it growing? Is it stable? Is it real? Is it happening yet? But nothing living stabilizes under constant disturbance. Seeds need darkness. Roots need depth. Becoming needs space. This is the difference between observing and interfering. True observation is spacious. It notices without tightening. It witnesses without correcting every movement. It allows the state to deepen. Interference, on the other hand, is restless. It peers into every shift. It tries to manage every fluctuation. It keeps the process trapped in the mind instead of allowing it to sink into the body. When the process stays trapped in the mind, it remains a temporary event, something you visit, something you you generate, something you perform when you remember. But identity does not live there. Identity descends into deeper systems. It settles into automatic patterns. It becomes the background hum of your life. And that can only happen when the mind stops grabbing at it every few seconds. There is a sacred moment in this journey when you realize your hyper-awareness is not helping anymore. It is interrupting integration. You do not need to correct every passing thought. You do not need to police every emotional wave. You do not need to flinch every time the old self echoes in the background. Why? Because the old self loses power through disuse, not through obsession. The new self becomes dominant through repetition without panic, through consistency without force, through familiarity without drama. So what does the shift actually look like? It looks simpler than the mind expects. You stop treating alignment like a crystal glass that could shatter if touched. You stop assuming one imperfect moment ruins the process. You stop micromanaging your inner world as though the field is waiting to punish one wrong emotion. You let the new state breathe. You let it be human. You let it be lived, not worshipped from a distance. And something remarkable happens when you do. The state becomes steadier. Not because you forced stability, but because you removed the pressure that kept shaking it. The identity begins to settle. Your body stops interpreting the process as a test. Your nervous system stops preparing for collapse. Your frequency stops spiking and crashing based on whether you think you did it right today. A deeper rhythm appears, more grounded, more relaxed, more real. That is when you begin to understand a profound truth. The field responds to being, not to spiritual effort. It responds to coherence, not to self-tension. It responds to the version of you that lives from the state naturally, not to the version of you frantically trying to preserve the state before it slips away. So ask yourself honestly, are you embodying this reality or are you supervising it? Are you allowing the new identity to become ordinary or are you making it so precious that you keep interfering with it? Are you trusting the signal or are you constantly checking whether the signal is pure enough to deserve a response? The answer matters because the more you interfere, the more you keep the process in motion without letting it land. The more you check, the more you announce that you do not quite believe it is yours. The more you control, the more you teach the body that this state is unstable, and instability cannot become your baseline. Only what feels safe enough to stop controlling can become who you are. And this is where the final realization arrives like a quiet thunderbolt. What has felt like a wall may not be a wall at all. What has felt like a mysterious block may not be an external force resisting you. What if nothing has been standing in your way except interruption? What if the process has been working, but every time it starts gaining momentum, you break the rhythm, you align, then you wait, you open, then you grasp, you soften, then you check, you step into the state, then you step back out to see whether it worked. Over and over again, the signal begins, and over again, the old pattern cuts across it. That changes everything, because now you no longer need to see yourself as someone failing. You do not need to create a dramatic story about hidden blocks or missing gifts or mysterious punishment from the universe. The issue becomes much more precise. You are not incapable. You are not unworthy. You are not behind. You are simply interrupting your own continuity. When a new identity begins to form, it needs steadiness. It needs repetition without panic. It needs space to become more familiar than the old emotional reflexes. Your brain begins to map new pathways. Your body begins learning a new relationship to reality. Your perception begins reorganizing around a different expectation. But if the old patterns keep rushing in with control, doubt, urgency, and checking, then the new pattern never gets enough uninterrupted time to become dominant. It flashes into awareness, then fades. It appears, then disappears, not because it is weak, but because it has not been allowed to stabilize. This is why the process can feel so close and yet so delayed. You are touching the new state. You are sensing the new self. You are entering the edge of the reality you want. The signal is not absent. It is active, but it has not remained uninterrupted long enough for the outer reflection to reorganize around it. The field is reading you, yes, but the field answers continuity. It answers the dominant state, the sustained state, the state you stop questioning long enough to live inside. And once you understand that, the entire conversation changes. You stop asking, what is wrong with me? You start asking, where do I keep breaking my own signal? You stop chasing new methods just to escape discomfort. You start noticing the exact exact moments when the old identity returns in subtle forms. The moment you look for proof, the moment you panic because nothing moved today, the moment you try to accelerate the process, the moment you tighten around timing, the moment you turn awareness into inspection. Those are the moments that matter, not because they mean you failed, but because they reveal where continuity is leaking. Can you feel how empowering that is? If the problem were lack, you would need to become more. If the problem were unworthiness, you would need to fix yourself. If the problem were a closed universe, you would need to fight reality. But if the real issue is interruption, then the path becomes simpler and more humane. You do not need to become extraordinary overnight. You do not need to strain toward perfection. You need to interrupt less. You need to trust more deeply. You need to let the state remain long enough to become ordinary. That is when manifestation starts feeling different, not dramatic, not theatrical, settled. Instead of living in the emotional weather of every outer circumstance, you begin resting in an inner climate that does not collapse every time reality stays quiet. You stop chasing the echo. You stop demanding immediate proof. You stop making every day into a verdict about whether the process is real. And in that stillness, the energy changes, not because you forced a miracle, but because you finally stopped cutting the roots of what was already growing. This is why the most powerful shift often feels almost invisible at first. There may be no fireworks, no cosmic announcement, no sudden trumpet from the sky. What happens is quieter and deeper. The need to interfere starts fading. You stop feeling compelled to micromanage. You stop treating time like an enemy. You stop assuming silence means nothing is happening. Something inside settles. And when that inner settling occurs, what once felt delayed starts to feel immediate. Not because reality suddenly learned how to move faster, but because you stopped resetting the process before it could mature. Read that again in your heart. The delay was not always time. Often, the delay was interruption stretched across time. Every moment of waiting added distance. Every burst of effort added tension. Every episode of checking paused the collapse. But once those patterns fall away, the channel clears. The signal becomes clean. Your inner state stops flickering between trust and control, and the reflection can finally appear without resistance because there is no longer a conflicting message canceling it out. This is when the conscious observer becomes stable. You are no longer observing from fear, from urgency, from several inner positions at once. You are observing from one place, a grounded place, a coherent place, a place that no longer asks reality to explain itself every 5 minutes. That stability changes your entire relationship with the field. You stop viewing life as something you must wrestle into form. You begin seeing it as a reflection that organizes around the consistency of your being. And then comes one of the deepest revelations of all. You were never late. You were never disqualified. You were never doing everything wrong. You were learning how to stop interfering with what was already unfolding. That realization carries immense freedom. It releases shame. It softens pressure. It invites trust back into the room. Suddenly, manifestation is not a frantic attempt to force outcomes. It becomes a practice of remaining in the state without begging, remaining in the identity without inspecting it, remaining in alignment without turning it into labor, remaining in the vibration without dramatizing every fluctuation. This is what true spiritual maturity looks like. Not control, not emotional perfection, not robotic positivity. It looks like inner steadiness. It looks like softness without collapse. It looks like certainty without noise. It looks like a person who can hold a new reality in consciousness long enough for the body to accept it and for the field to mirror it back. So if you take anything into your soul from this message, let it be this. You do not need to make the process happen. You need to stop disrupting it. You do not need to become louder in the field. You need to become cleaner. You do not need to multiply techniques. You need to reduce contradiction. You do not need to chase the future. You need to let the future become the atmosphere of your present. That is where the quantum shift occurs. The moment your inner world stops splitting itself between desire and doubt, between vision and verification, between becoming and being, your frequency changes. Your vibration becomes coherent. Your alignment becomes lived rather than performed. And once your being stops arguing with itself, the reflection begins to clarify. So breathe. Release the habit of urgency. Release the craving for constant signs. Release the impulse to inspect every step. Let the seed stay in the soil. Let the new self become ordinary. Let your system learn peace with the unseen. Let the conscious observer remain steady inside the unknown, because the unknown is not empty. It is pregnant with reorganization. It is full of unseen movement. It is where reality is learning your new signature. Stay there. Stay there when nothing external moves. Stay there when old thoughts knock. Stay there when the mind wants proof. Stay there when timing tries to seduce you back into fear. Stay there when the familiar self whispers that nothing is changing. Stay there because every moment of non-interference teaches your body a new law of reality. Every moment of coherence strengthens the signal. Every moment of relaxed certainty invites the field to mirror a cleaner pattern. And eventually, what once seemed far away begins to arrive with a strange sense of inevitability, not as a lucky surprise, but as the outer expression of a state that finally stopped being interrupted. That is the real quantum leap. It is not the fantasy of instant results without inner transformation. It is the moment the inner world becomes so coherent that outer reality has nothing left to argue with. It is the moment your identity settles so fully that manifestation no longer feels like trying. It feels like reflection. It feels like life catching up to who you have become. If this message spoke to something deep inside you, subscribe now, leave a comment below, and share this video with someone who is ready to awaken, expand their consciousness, and enter their next quantum leap. Let this be the moment you stop fighting the process and start trusting the power of a coherent inner world.